So, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is the Managing Director of IBIS World, a forecasting and advisory corporation with a global reputation for providing outstanding insights into business trends to corporations and to governments. He's widely considered one of the nation's most respected strategists and futurists on business, social and economic matters. He's currently an adjunct professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, a member of the ANU College of Business and Economics Advisory Board. He's a recent past board member of the Melbourne Institute, the Committee for Economic Development Australia, and a past director of Open Family Australia, where he continues to provide assistance as an ambassador for White Lion and Open Family. He was a Rotary Youth Exchange student in the 1960s, and he was telling me a little earlier that that trip to Oklahoma changed his life. Would you please welcome Mr. Phil Ruthven AM.
Thank you very much indeed, Tracy. And may I start by congratulating Mike and the National Australia Bank for its sponsorship too, how important that is. So well done, Mike. And so can I say good afternoon, President Julie, other distinguished guests, Rotarians and any other guests or hangers-on that happen to be here today to have fun. Now, I must say to you, as a long-range forecaster and futurist, which I suppose I am, a view of 2050, which is what I've been asked to talk about, doesn't really scare me all that much. Mind the fact that I might be with God at that stage or whoever may be pertinent as well. What I think is impressive is being asked to talk about 2050 by an organisation that, as you know better than I do, is 110 years old. Began as a knife and fork club, of course, as we well know, and has become probably the most generous, I think, benefactor in the world today, and probably the least boastful. In many ways, I think Rotary, whilst it's well known, is a quiet achiever, and I don't know that many people realise just the enormous leverage that you create as individuals and a group for the betterment of Australia and many other countries around the world. Enough of that, but I mean that. What am I going to talk about for the next hour or two? Try 20 minutes, that's okay, Tracy, I didn't want you to have a heart attack. I want to share with you my thoughts on three areas, which hopefully does create a very long-term perspective for you. Firstly, just to put Australia into global perspective for the year 2016. Where are we and where are we going in respect to the world at large? A world made up of 230 nations, so there's a lot of us out there. Secondly, I'd like to talk about our own country, its past, present and future, and where we're going. And finally, our analysis of where social clubs, such as Rotary, are at the present time and where they seem to be heading and some of the challenges as well. So enough of that. First of all, some perspective. 2016 is an interesting year when one just looks at the major countries of the world, and that's what this chart does. It looks at what share of the entire world's economy is coming mainly from the 20 largest economies, as you can see there, because they're all coloured, and they are a very significant top 20, of course. But 2016 is interesting because it's the first year since 1870 that China has regained the position of being the world's largest economy. Now, China had been the world's largest economy for several thousand years, up to the 1870s, and the only reason it fell out of the top 5 and even the top 10 for a while was that it didn't adopt the Industrial Revolution at the same time as England and America did. And it was so late adopting it that it fell right out of the top 10, has now climbed back into them since it adopted the Industrial Revolution, of course, in the post-war years, and has now regained its spot as number 1, with the United States now number 2 for the first time really since the late 1800s when it overtook the British Commonwealth of Nations, of course. The other thing that's interesting on that chart is to see that India has now overtaken Japan, reminding us in a sense that we are moving into a quite extraordinary new era, and of course it is called the Asian era, and probably for good reason, because if you look at this next map of the world, it shows those 230 nations clustered together in 8 regions. And if you look down the bottom right-hand side, you can see that the Asia-Pacific region, which is our region, made up of China and everything south, It's virtually a third of the world's economy today, and of course certainly more than a third of the population. And if you combine that with the Indian subcontinent of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Maldives, etc., then you're looking at a share of the world that's pretty close to about 42% of the world economy. So when they say it's the Asia century, they're so right, because it is that. And in fact, even the Asia Pacific at the present time is getting awfully close to being twice the size of the whole of the North American region, which consists of the United States, Canada and Mexico. And it's almost virtually within a year of being twice the size of Western and Central Europe, which is basically the EU as we know. And it's quite extraordinary to know that the EU, as recently as 15 years ago, was pretty close to 28% of the world economy, and it's now down to 18. And it's almost as if Europe's going through the second fall of the Roman Empire 1,500 years later. And I don't say that with any joy, except to say that clearly the EU has got its problems, getting those nations together and being able to make them work. And they've got some time ahead of it to do just that, with even England thinking that they might leave it through Brexit. But most of the countries are starting to come together into those regions. Some of them have become sovereign regions, and the EU is indeed a sovereign region. To some extent, North America is heading that way too, of course, through NAFTA agreement. Eastern Europe, which of course is the Russian Federation, so that's already a sovereign region. The Asia Pacific has formed itself into a club called APEC, so we're heading that way as well. So in a sense, we're starting to see more trade and cooperation within nations, within regions, than we've ever seen in the entire history of the world. And I think by the middle of this century, all of those 8 regions will pretty well have got together as almost sovereign regions. I've even got great hopes for the Middle East. I think they'll come together within the next 1,000 years or so too. They've got a slightly bigger problem than the rest of us, as we well know. But Asia's economy, which is where we are, why is it important? Well, I'll touch on that in a moment, but almost all of our trade, our immigration and our tourism is coming now from Asia rather than from any other part of the world. And you can see there's 2 elephants in the room, as they say, in our region. That's of course China and India. We're only a very small segment. You can see that pink area, which is Australia. We're only 2.5% of our own region, and we're only just over 1% of the world. But we do bat well above our weight, as we well know, because we are in the top 10 highest standard of living countries in the world. That's not bad out of 230. And we have 5 of the 10 most livable cities in the world here in Australia as well. So we do bat well above our weight, being where we are. But the growth of Asia is phenomenal. World growth this year will be around about 2.7%, give or take a decimal point, doesn't matter. But the growth in Asia will average over 6%, and it's been doing that for quite some time. So our region of Asia, being both the Asia Pacific plus the Indian subcontinent, is growing at well over twice the pace of the rest of the world. And I tell you what really thrills me about that chart is to look at what was countries that were under the thumb, either with colonels running the joint instead of democracy, like Myanmar. You've got Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Sri Lanka, all up there in the fastest growing areas of countries of Asia. And once upon a time, you've got that growth by giving them, or you thought you would, by giving them a lot of aid, foreign aid. But of course, what I think we do know in the 21st century is the best way for a country to grow is to grow itself by, first of all, having an honest leader, a non-corrupt government, democracy, if you can give it to them, and then the money will flow. Companies will pour in the capital to build a nation for you. You don't need aid if you've got honest government. And sometimes you do need almost a competent, benevolent dictator to set the place alight. And I used to try and say that about Singapore, but I would have been locked up in jail had I said that when Lee Kuan Yew did what he did, which was so fantastic. But you do need leadership and you do need good, non-corrupt governments, and that's what's happening throughout Asia, slowly but surely. And I think that's very encouraging. But what a free kick for Australia to be in Asia for the 21st and the 22nd century. So, when we look towards 2050 and beyond, you'd have to say how lucky can we get to be part of the world's most dynamic, fast-growing regions as it is. And we have integrated our economy and society into Asia, and we're doing that perhaps more particularly with China, as most other people are. And it is a mega region, as I've described, which is huge and growing very fast. And as I've already said, and I'll just repeat that the vast bulk of our exports, of our inbound tourists and our inbound immigrants are coming from Asia. So we are, in fact, integrating into this wonderful, exciting region, not without its challenges and problems. We know that just looking at China at the present time, or if you like, the very slow growth in Japan, which is sad. It's not a problem without challenges, but by God, it's got more good things going for it than not. Now, I'm going to, before I leave the world, just talk a little bit about countries that are happy or unhappy. The way I'm going to do that is to use what we call the Consumer Sentiment Index. You could shorten that to consumer confidence, if you like. And the Consumer Confidence Index has been put out since the early 1970s. So we're looking at over 40 years history now of whether countries are happy or not. When I start showing these charts, there'll be a chart with a graph on them, and at the point which says 100 in the centre, when you've got 100 points, it means that your society is a bit schizophrenic about whether it should be happy or not. Because at 100 points, you've got half the people think things are going to get worse next year, and the other half think they're going to get better. So anything more than 100 points says that you are happy and confident about the future. Anything below 100 points means you're not all that happy at all. Now, I thought I'd begin with our next door neighbour, New Zealand, who've got no right to be that happy, which means I'm jealous. So anybody here who's an ex-Kiwi, good on you. And all I want is John Keys, when you're finished with him, as your Prime Minister, because he seems to be doing a pretty fantastic job. Now, mind you, compared to where they used to be, under some really colourful characters like Piggy Muldoon and David Longy, who were larger than life, they certainly are a very happy bunch over there at the present time, and good luck to them. Now, then you've got the United States, who is really schizoid, because they reach heights of happiness and depths of despair that we've never even thought about. And if you're wondering what made them so happy back there in the year 2000, it was the Monica Lewinsky affair. It was the most exciting distraction from politics they'd had for about 100 years. And of course, the depth of despair was the GFC, which we all know about, when, of course, those fraudsters in Wall Street went to town with the subprime loans and all the rest of it. But they've fought their way out of that, and they're reasonably happy with an election coming this year. And in fact, that's the other thing that makes 2016 such an interesting year. They've got an election, we've got an election, the Olympic Games are on, and England's going to decide whether it stays in or out of Europe. I mean, that's enough things to give it more excitement than even the Melbourne Cup, I would have thought, this year. But anyway, that's America. So they're up and down. You know, they reach heights of extremes, which is unbelievable. Now, of course, most of Australia's early settlers came from the next country I'm going to show, which is Pommyland. And I've never known how to make a Pom happy. They are simply extraordinary. In fact, happiness is so rare, I should talk about the 3 times they've been happy since World War II. That first splash of blue was when they had the hottest summer in England in 1978, and they could go to the beach. The next one was more important than religion, because it was when they held the Euro Cup final, and that was very, very exciting. And the last one, of course, was the Olympic Games. And they'll go back to being their normal, miserable self very shortly. But if you think the Poms are bad, have a look at the frogs. Oh dear, oh dear. There's almost no hope, is there, really? Anyway, they've got nice food, so there's more to life than happiness, I suppose. But I've said that to a couple of French waitresses, because they're out here in huge numbers at the moment. I wouldn't blame them with the problems they got there. And they look, you know, I've showed one of them with each other. Yeah, that's about right, that's us, you know. So by difference, Australia looks pretty good, you see. And so if I'm going to say what should we be happy about, it's that whilst we're up and down, you know, like a drunken duck in a cornfield at midnight, we are mostly happy doing what we're doing. And we're almost back to 100 points at the present time, with an election coming up, and we're not too sure. We think after 3 bad Prime Ministers and 1 uncertain one, we're sort of hopeful it's got to get a lot better. So we're just sitting on the fence wondering at the present time. So compared to the world, we're not that bad. Now that takes me into Australia's future. And the best way I could suggest to you to be happy is to look at where we've come from over the last 230 odd years, because this shows the standard of living of Australians, and that's in what we call real economic output per person. It's another way of almost graphing our real wages. There is no inflation on this chart. These are all real figures. So you can see the tremendous recent future we've had. Now, I'm here to tell you also that over that 230 years, Australia's had 4 depressions and it's had 27 recessions. A recession is when you have a negative year. A depression is when you have more than one year negative in a row, usually 4. Like the 1840s, 1890s, 1930s, etc. And I'm here to say, how could you get miserable when you know that there's been that many setbacks and yet we still keep going forward? And during that period, of course, we've moved through quite a few different ages of development. The hunting and trapping age, of course, which was the age of the Aboriginal population. The agrarian age, when agriculture and mining started to take off with the English settlers. The industrial age, where we were around about 60 or 70 years behind England in getting into manufacturing, which we did. And then the new age we're in, which started in the 1960s when manufacturing started to fade from its dominance, because back in those days it was about 30% of all the jobs, now it's down to about 7% of all the jobs, 7%, and we're still doing well. So it proves there is life after agriculture and life after manufacturing. And the best is yet to come, I'm here to tell you. If you want to look out towards the year 2050, 2050 is around about where that dotted line is at the start of what I call the Enlightenment age. And the Enlightenment age I want to come back for, and I've just changed to the Hindu religion so I can. Well, I haven't quite, but I'm thinking of it. And although somebody didn't like me once, said I'd probably come back as a cockroach. And they've changed their mind. That person's now happy with me. But seriously, how could you get miserable when you look at a chart like that? It's not as if we're going to suddenly fall off a cliff. It's not going to happen. And we're heading into that 2050 period where our standard of living again, even before 2050, will more than double over that period of time. It'll more than double over the next 34 years. And that's pretty darn significant to think it'll more than double over that period of time. It could even go close to trebling. And the Enlightenment age will be a very exciting age for which the young people, some of whom are going to be following me as speakers, I think, but what a future they have got. It's become a very technical age, as we know. Sometimes we call the present age the digital disruption age. But really, the excitement that's going to be generated in that period will be nothing short of astonishing. I think something like about 98% of all the decisions we make in life or in business will be made for us by clever computers and software of one sort or another, freeing up our brain and our cells to concentrate on things that are even more exciting and more creative and really more interesting. So it's going to be a truly, truly exciting era that we move into at that period of time. In terms of what industries are going to be dominating the economy, this chart shows where we've been, if you like, over the last 200 years or so, highlighting in red that there was a time when things like agriculture and mining dominated our economy, right through almost into the early part of the century. Then that orange area, which is mostly manufacturing and construction and utilities, but mostly manufacturing, that was the industrial age when that orange area dominated. Our new age is being dominated by the green-coloured industries, which those to do with either information or finance, and those things are like software and information industries, education, of course, government, and finance, insurance. And they're the industries that have been roaring through during that period from the 1960s right through until about 2050, which is the horizon that I've been asked to speak about today. But coming up pretty fast already is that blue area, and heading that is probably going to be health. And health is already now the biggest single employer in Australia, employing over 1.5 million people, and manufacturing is now down to half that number. So we are living in different times. Are they better or worse? They're better. We can be nostalgic about the past, but embracing the future and all that has to offer is far more exciting. This is where our industries are at the present time. You can see that agriculture is not that big, and that's almost a little sad to say that. It will get revived in a new era of agriculture as we start to face the food security issues of China and India, and we start to go into another very exciting era of agriculture. But it currently is very small. Mining's quite big, and it probably won't get any bigger than that because we've just been through a boom. So that will probably retreat back to about 4% of the economy, which is where it normally sits for a while. You can see the industrial areas of manufacturing, etc., are now quite small. and you can see just how important the service industries are, the green and the blue areas. And incidentally, if any of you want a copy of any of these slides for yourself, your kids or your friends or your workmates, you certainly are welcome to a complete soft copy of this at some other stage, whenever you like. Now, this last chart that I want to finish off with talking about Australia, I think sells its own optimism, if I can say that, because we're told over and over again in the media these days that jobs are disappearing out of the car industry, out of the smelting industry, and in aluminium smelting, they're disappearing everywhere. What they're not telling us is that every year we actually create 5 times more jobs than we lose, every year. This chart goes back over 5 years to show that we've created 5 times more jobs than we had 5 years ago, than we've lost over that period of time. And I don't know why we don't get told that more often, because people say, oh, the car industry and all the spare parts industry and whatever. Do you know that if we lost which we will, nearly every job in car manufacturing, we replace all of those jobs every 3.5 months each year. Every 3.5 months we replace the number of jobs that we're going to lose in the whole car and parts industry in Australia. So whilst there is some nostalgia with things that go, if we don't embrace the future in all the holes, then we really are travelling backwards for Christmas. And I had an engineer say to me one time at a speech several months ago, he said, oh, it's all very well for you, Phil, to say, I'm an engineer, I've been trained in the manufacturing area, you tell me where the new jobs are going to be that's going to suit an engineer. I said, well, try health. He said, don't be bloody ridiculous, I'm not a doctor. And I said, because you can see on that chart just how many industries, jobs are being created in health. I said, do you mean to tell me there's no equipment in the hospitals or any of the other parts of health, that need, engineers to look after them, whether it be MRI machines or whatever? Oh, I never thought about that. In other words, don't make yourself miserable. The world's too exciting and too prospective a place to ever... You can only be miserable if you want to stay in the past or go backwards, and I'm not one of those people, and I hope none of you are either. Yes, we are, as you can see on the right-hand side, losing jobs out of manufacturing, but you can see that almost one industry alone, professional and technical services, makes up for all of those every year. Oh no, we have got a fabulous future, and whilst we're not quite back to full employment, we're going to get there fairly soon. I'm going to finish off just talking about social clubs a bit, and a few statistics, and they can be boring, so I won't dwell on these too much, but if you look at the industry in which Rotary sits, which is called the social clubs and community associations industry, because every industry is covered in Australia. There's 509 industries in Australia, interesting enough, the Bureau of Statistics labels them, from really growing oats through to the sowing of wild oats. And the second of those has got a higher turnover than the first, incidentally, too, but I'm not here to talk about that. And thank God I don't know much about it anyway. But the revenue of your industry this year, 2016, is estimated to be just under $9 billion. So it's a pretty thumping big industry with a lot of players. There's over 8,600, it says businesses there, but it really means probably associations as well, of course. But the one that's a little bit worrying, and you know it as well as I do, is the second figure down there, which is growth over the next 5 years. And it is growing, but very slowly. In other words, clubs have had great difficulty since the start of this century in keeping members and getting new ones. I was asked to speak at a golf club function a few years ago in New Zealand, and by 2009 they'd already lost 10% of their members across New Zealand and almost Australia. In other words, getting members of clubs has become very difficult. In fact, Rotary's got so desperate it's now even got women in them, apparently, and that is a compliment, ladies, as you understand. Because the business club I've got in Melbourne doesn't have any women, and more's the pity. So, in a sense, there is a challenge out there. It is either hard work or it's different work to look at what clubs are going to be like in the future. And I'm going to touch on a bit of that, but I can tell you the people who are going to follow me will know a damn sight more than I do as well. But what sort of clubs are there in this $9 billion industry that you're in? Well, the biggest single one pretty well is the one that you guys are in, guys meaning guys and gals, and that's what we call community and recreational social clubs. And that's just over a fifth of all the revenue of clubs across Australia. Now, you know as well as I do that Rotary turns over tens of millions of dollars a year. And by God, I meant what I said when I opened up this address by saying the good you guys do, meaning guys and girls, is simply astonishing and in the nature of a quiet achiever. And as Tracy said, I'm one of the beneficiaries of that. She was quite right when she said I was a beneficiary. I was a GSE awardee in 1967, just as the GSE system started. And that trip to America changed my life. It was one of the things that led me to starting my own company now, which is the world's largest online industry database company and the most successful. And I don't take all the credit for that. I think my own staff need more credit than I do. But I'd have to thank a trip, and I won't bore you with how that happened, but it was a trip to America as a GSE student. So, and how many lives you've changed is just enormous. It really is. Now, some of the challenges that a club could face, including Rotary, okay, I think first of all, generational attitudes and lifestyle preferences are clearly coming through with the different generations. And I'm going to, my last slide is actually going to be the different generations in Australia and how one needs to reach the newer generations. A challenge of having no gender discrimination, well, you've already passed that test at Rotary some time back, but a lot of clubs haven't done that yet. The challenge of dual or multiple working households and the time issues that go with that have proved to be quite difficult. I mean, when I first started work, married women were pretty well banned from the workforce back in the 1960s. It wasn't until the late 60s that married women weren't discriminated against. Well, nowadays you just assume that a young married couple will have both the husband and the wife working, and they'll have children, of course, but they'll often be back to work, so that there is a time issue associated with working households that is an issue. The frequency of involvement, how often do you meet as a member of a club, is probably an issue that's related to that one above. The traditional attendance policies may well prove to be a barrier, although I think Rotary's dealt with that one quite well over many, many years. The perceived importance and relevance of being a member of a club is something that has to be sold all the time, I suspect, as well, because if it's seen to be a club where you may or may not need to join, I guess the benefits of that club, not just to the person that joins the club, but what they're going to do for society is very important. And I think the better side of humanity is what they can do for others more than themselves. And I think Rotary's long had that tradition too, for which I congratulate you. I think networking potential is still very important, and that's always been an interesting part of Rotary, where you don't like to have duplicate careers in your club so that you've got diversity, and I think that's a very, very important one too. That doesn't mean that networking doesn't happen, because it does, and it does very effectively. And I think the last thing is the digital age tribalism versus traditional tribalism. By that I mean that when I was growing up, the street was probably your main tribe, because you all went to the same school, your mums met each other, and you played up and down the street. These days, you wouldn't know who your next neighbour was, and if you did, you're probably sorry you did. No, I'm joking about that. And, but you know, people living in apartments, you often don't know who they are. And tribalism is alive and well, but it's not geographic anymore. Most people that belong not on a geographic basis, but on the basis of either their sport or their work or something like that. And if you take the net generation, which I'm about to talk about in just a moment, and finally, their tribe is really on the internet, if you like, you know, between Twitter and all the rest of it. And then that can drive parents mad. I had one mother recently pointing out that her son was going to turn 21, you know, in 3 weeks' time, and she had no, or she was talking about this historically. She said, you know, I had to remind him that he was turning 21, and well, which he knew, but that we better have a party. And he said, oh, well, maybe. And so he finally agreed they should have a party, and where he didn't care much. She said, how many think would come? He said, I've got no idea. Well, when would I know? He said, oh, I can tell you on the Saturday morning if you like, Mum. And that's what happened. And he just got on his mobile, and it turned out 80 people came. Now that's what sends us into old age and despair, you know, and dementia. And I've always pointed out to young mothers, the first 40 years is the hardest, and because after that you start to lose your mind and you don't worry anymore. But putting that to one side, how do clubs deal with the digital tribalism, which is where we're going with the young people? Which leads me to my last chart, and that is that being able to identify what each generation is like and wants is going to be one of the most challenging things moving towards 2050. Rotary has every right to go for another 110 years. Its philosophy and its culture is brilliant. But the way it does it, it clearly may have to change. And you have been changing in a number of ways already, which you've alluded to. But it's that next generation over the far right-hand side, which is now, in a sense, the most populous generation we've got. This year, well, last year, by the end of last year, 2015, the next generation, being those aged between then 33 down to 14, outnumbered the baby boomers for the first time in history. That's the future of Australia, and learning how to reach that generation is going to be the greatest challenge, and it may well involve things which are different to the way Rotary's been successful in the past for 110 years. Good luck with that journey, and thanks for listening.